Hi, Leigh. We're here to talk about owner strategy, which is a critical set of decisions made by families about what they want from the businesses they own. How do you think about putting owner strategy into practice?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's really important, not that it's just something that sits on a piece of paper or in a slide deck, and it's really something that the family is able to use. And so, after the families come up with their owner strategy, then it's important for them to decide how they're going to use it. And to give one example, we had a family who took their owner strategy and communicate it to the board once a year. And so it's something that the board sees that guidance and they have a discussion together to say, how are we performing against our expectations? Um, and they have that discussion. They're able to ask questions, provide that guidance, and get that input. And then each year they kind of revisit it in a small way to say, do we need to tweak anything here or is it still good? And so eventually they'll probably refresh it in a larger way. But for now, they kind of look at that thing as an annual guidance.
What are the components of an owner strategy statement?
An owner strategy statement has a few different components and they're all important. It usually starts with a purpose statement where the family talks about what is it? Why are we in business together? Why is it that we do this? There's a lot of challenges in working together, but there can be so many benefits to it. And so the purpose part of it really captures that why behind it. And it's really that driving force for the family. Some families also identify their owner values as part of this. So, not the business values or what's happening in the business, but really as a family, how do they want to work together? And how do they want to, lead those meetings, lead those discussions together? And then the owner strategy also has goals and guardrails, and that gets deeper into what they're looking for. So, are they looking for growth? Are they looking for liquidity? Are they looking for control? Where are their priorities and what are those trade offs going to be? Because you can't have everything, even though that'd be great. You usually have to have some sort of priorities and trade off in other ways. And then the guardrails are really those boundaries of kind of where they expect, and those can be detailed sort of metrics. And that's really where it gets helpful to say, here's our expectation, and then you can measure that performance against that to see how are we doing against our goals, and is this helping us live to our purpose.
So say more about that. Say more about the guardrails. What do those look like? What are some of the guardrails? Give me an example of a real alive family that went through that process. How did they communicate those financial expectations, and to whom did they communicate them to?
The guardrails, this is where it can look different and should look different for families. So, to give one example, a family really had some detailed financial metrics. They said things like, we want to be pretty conservative with our debt. It's important for us to be able to control the decisions and to be able to continue a growth, but not in a way that's going to jeopardize the business. They had one operating business, so it's very important to them. They preserve it and grow it. And so for them, one of their metrics, for example, was a maximum debt to EBITDA ratio. So they said, we don't want to go above this metric so that we can make sure that we're staying conservative. They also had a growth metric as an example. So they would do return on invested capital to see how their investment in the business was doing. So they chose metrics like that were pretty detailed and gives the board a good idea of how the business is operating against those expectations. And they picked out some peer groups and looked at some comparisons to see where are we against some of the other competitors in the marketplace. Um, on the other hand, there can be non financial metrics as well. And so this can vary as well. Some families might choose to have something specific, like we want a net employee promoter score of a certain metric to say we want our employees to be happy, and therefore let's try to shoot for this range. Other families might say, might not get to the detail stage, but say here are the non-financial aspects that are important to us, such as employees or sustainability. And then it's really up to the board to come back with some suggestions and how the board is tracking it so that the owners have that awareness, but doesn't necessarily have to be driven from the owner perspective. Let some of the other board members and committee members who are really in the weeds and know how to measure that come back with that data.
Yeah, that's really important. We're working with a family now who they went through sort of a circular process to try to figure out some non-financial metrics that reflected their values. And because of their distance from the business, they really struggled with that. And so, but what they were able to say more clearly was here are our values, and those values would included employee safety, they included customer service, they included commitment to their community. And they went and they asked their board, not necessarily even for metrics, but for a description of the initiatives or the investments or the activities that the company was undertaking in pursuit of those values. And they were able then to get on that report out a sense of, is that enough, too much, or not enough in each of those areas.
Great. Did they also have financial metrics that they used in with those?
They did, and I think that there can be a bit of a mistake if you try to pinpoint, especially across a single metric, a single financial metric. That's something that we see, that we see some families try to do, but chasing a return on equity target or any other single metric can really create a set of misaligned incentives between the owners and the board. People are going to chase and try to succeed along that single dimension. And when we see families finding more success by giving directional guidance to boards of, what do we want out of this company? Do we expect it to compound over time? So we're going to take a limited amount of dividends and we're going to reinvest a lot. Are we going to accelerate growth by reinvesting all of our profits, no dividends, maybe being really aggressive with acquisitions? Is this a cash producer, cash cow, where we're taking dividends out? We don't care too much about appreciation. Think about, a core real estate holdings, or this fourth category of almost like a trophy asset, something that's going to appreciate over time but doesn't produce cash. It might be a sports team, might be holding land, and just sort of categorizing what is it that we want out of this from a financial perspective, and then taking a holistic look at what the drivers of return or profit are for that business is really important. And then being careful about how you benchmark it. We see some families try to get a little overly specific on benchmarking, and every benchmark is really just a different version of wrong. And so it, we encourage families to really build up the qualifications of what it means to be an owner, so that we can really understand what are the drivers of revenue, what sort of profit margin should we expect, what are we doing with the profits that we generate, are we reinvesting those profits, or are we distributing them? If we're reinvesting them, into what are we expecting growth, are we getting it? And that speaks to the critical part of this owner strategy, which is how are you communicating it? And we had a family that actually wrote an owner strategy statement, gave it to the board, but they missed a really important part, which was a dialogue with the board. And so having a constructive dialogue to ensure that there's alignment on what these words are intended to mean and deliver, so that the board could actually use this document as an acid test to say, oh yeah, we understand, we're going to do more of that and less of that to help drive success in the eyes of the owners.
That's great. And it reminds me of think of a even throughout the process, it can be helpful to get the board's input and have those conversations early. So get both input and share the thinking along the way. And then it sets up for more effective conversations once the owner strategy is finalized by the family.
Yeah, how do you know when you're done with your owner strategy statement?
That's a tough one because I think the tendency for a lot of folks is to feel like you want it to be perfect. You have every word on the page right, and so it can be hard to really put the pen down and decide that you're that everybody's set with it. And I think at a certain point, It's really once you've captured the main ideas and everybody's comfortable with the content of it, even if the words aren't exactly how one person would write it. Because oftentimes these are a group effort and should reflect the whole family. And so ultimately, you kind of have the discussion about, is this something that everyone can live with, and do you agree with the core messages that are in here? And then you kind of agree to use it, and with the expectation that you're probably going to tweak it along the way. So as you have those conversations with the board, you might make some adjustments, but ultimately you're there, you're kind of using it, and it's active.
What's the right time to revisit your owner strategy? Like, when would you make a major shift, and what would that look like?
I think, yeah, it's great to revisit it and not just kind of tweak it here and there, but do a really more of a refresh or a harder look at it. Probably every 5 to 7 years, but mostly when there are big changes. So if the business undergoes a big shift, maybe a family sold a business or maybe they acquired a new business. That's a great time to relook at the strategy to see does this still make sense. And also when families go through a generational transition, I think sometimes what one generation kind of prioritized and what their goals were could look different in the next generation. And so that's a good opportunity for the next generation or maybe cross generations to have that conversation about what's important.
Yeah, that's good. We're working with a family now that they have one of their businesses is a real estate business, and it had always been sort of this cash producer, and it wasn't really about growth. And they're revisiting their owner strategy to decide, do we want something different out of this? Do we have different set of financial expectations? And if we do, what are we going to have to do differently? And one of the things that they realized they would have to do differently is, this has been a really wonderful, steady producer of dividends for the family. And they said, well, if we want to reinvest those dollars into more growth oriented assets, we're going to have to forego our dividends. And it was a decision they ended up making, but and they did it, as you described, in the midst of a generational transition, when they were going not from a, it wasn't a full step from a second generation to a third, but it was when the second and third generations were owning this business together. What do we want out of this particular asset?
Yeah, that sounds like it's a great time for them to revisit and kind of check what they're looking for. I think kind of similar situation or example, we're working with a family who are going through a generational transition, but also kind of a shift in the enterprise. So, in moving away from control, it really opened up the opportunity for them to work with more partners. So, rather than having to have 100% equity stake in the businesses that they were investing with, they decided that they could continue along the path of having more partners in the business. And so, therefore, they could focus more on growth and liquidity because they didn't have to have 100% control in everything.
So they could expand their enterprise with other people's money.
Yeah, exactly.
Love it. Thanks for chatting with me today, Leigh, about owner strategy and owner strategy statements. It's always a valuable exercise to talk about how to move something from the theoretical to the practical. And I think the examples you shared were incredibly valuable. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. It was great talking to you, and I loved hearing the examples.